Hello everyone, and welcome back to Snowbound Screams. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of America, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts. Each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. Family secrets are perhaps the most disturbing of all mysteries, for they dwell behind closed doors and within bloodlines, carried across generations like genetic memory. What happens when these secrets surface? When the carefully constructed walls of privacy crumble to reveal what should have remained buried? The stories we explore tonight come from ordinary families who discovered something extraordinary and terrible within their own histories. These are not tales of supernatural monsters or otherworldly visitors, but rather the human capacity for concealment, deception, and the darkness that can grow in the soil of kinship. Each account has been documented through official records, first-hand testimony, and corroborating evidence. The names have been changed to protect the living, but the events remain as they were recorded. In family homes across America, from the misty hollows of Appalachia to the sun-bleached suburbs of the Southwest, these secrets waited patiently until the day they would be uncovered. Now, let us begin. With our first story, it was late October of 2008 when David and Sarah Miller purchased the old farmhouse in rural West Virginia. The property had been in David's family for 3 generations, though no one had lived there since his great-grandparents' mysterious deaths in 1952. The house stood on a hill overlooking a valley. Its weathered, clapboard siding faded to the color of old bone. The Millers had moved from Baltimore with their 2 children, seeking a quieter life away from the city's relentless pace. David, a history professor, was particularly drawn to the family connection, hoping to preserve what remained of his ancestral home. Sarah, an architect, saw potential in the neglected structure, planning a careful renovation that would respect the original craftsmanship while updating it for modern living. The children, 12-year-old Emily and 9-year-old Michael, were less enthusiastic about leaving their friends behind, but found themselves intrigued by the sprawling property and the promise of rooms to explore. The first few weeks passed in a blur of unpacking and minor repairs, the family gradually acclimating to the rhythms of country life. The autumn air grew crisp, the surrounding forests transformed into a tapestry of red and gold, and the house began to feel less like an inheritance and more like a home. The discovery happened during the renovation of the 3rd-floor attic, which Sarah had designated as her new home office. While removing a section of damaged plaster, David noticed an unusual draft coming from behind the wall. Upon further investigation, he found what appeared to be the outline of a doorway that had been plastered over. With careful work, they uncovered a small wooden door, approximately 4 feet high, with an antique iron latch. There was no key, but the lock had rusted through, and the door opened with a persistent shove. The space beyond was not a typical attic storage area, but a small room, perhaps 6 by 8 feet, with no windows and a dirt floor. The walls were lined with shelves holding glass jars of various sizes, each containing what appeared to be animal specimens, preserved birds, rodents, and other small creatures. In the center of the room stood a wooden table with strange markings etched into its surface, and hanging from the ceiling were several bird cages, though none contained living creatures. The air was thick with the smell of formaldehyde and something else, something vaguely medicinal yet unsettling. Sarah immediately felt a sense of unease, while David, despite his academic curiosity, found himself reluctant to touch anything. The children, who had followed their parents up the attic stairs, peered into the room with wide eyes before Sarah firmly sent them downstairs. Over the following days, David's research into the room's purpose yielded disturbing information. Local historical archives revealed that his great-grandfather, Elias Miller, had been a respected physician in the community, but also a practitioner of folk medicine and unusual scientific experiments. Neighbors' accounts from the 1950s described strange lights in the farmhouse windows at night, and occasional screams that Elias explained as experimental animals. More troubling were the police reports from the night of Elias and his wife Mary's deaths. The official cause was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace, but the responding officer's private notes mentioned finding the couple in ritualistic positions and evidence of what he termed unusual medical procedures. The most chilling discovery came when David found a hidden compartment beneath the dirt floor containing a leather-bound journal written in Elias's hand. The entries described not just scientific experiments, but attempts to communicate with deceased family members through what Elias called biological mediums, preserved animals that supposedly served as vessels for spirits. The final entry, dated the night of his death, spoke of a breakthrough in his work and his intention to include his wife in the experiment. "The barrier grows thin," he wrote. "Mary has agreed to join me. The children must not know until it is complete." The disturbances began subtly. Doors would open on their own, particularly the door to the hidden room, which no amount of securing could keep closed. Objects would move from where they were placed, only to reappear in inexplicable locations. Emily reported seeing a woman in old-fashioned clothing standing at the foot of her bed, though when Sarah rushed to her room, there was no one there. Michael became withdrawn, spending hours drawing pictures of birds in cages and talking to himself in a corner of his new bedroom. Sarah, ever the rationalist, attempted to explain these occurrences as the natural result of settling into an old house. But even she began to feel a growing sense of unease. The family started sleeping with lights on, and the children refused to go to the attic alone. David, meanwhile, became obsessed with his great-grandfather's journal, spending nights poring over the entries and cross-referencing them with local historical records. He discovered that several children had gone missing in the area during the 1940s and early 1950s. Cases that had never been solved. The official police reports made no connection to Elias Miller, but newspaper articles from the time mentioned rumors of strange experiments at the Miller farmhouse. The escalation came in early December, as winter tightened its grip on the valley. One evening, Sarah went to check on the children and found Michael standing in his room, facing the wall, speaking in a voice that was not his own. "The specimens must be preserved," the child said in a monotone voice that seemed to carry an older cadence. "The vessels must be prepared." When Sarah tried to turn him around, she found his body unnaturally rigid, his eyes wide and unseeing. David rushed in at her scream, and together they managed to get Michael onto his bed, where he eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Michael remembered nothing of the incident. But Emily reported hearing her brother talking to someone in his room the night before, though when she looked, he had been alone. That same day, David discovered that several of the jars in the hidden room had been moved, their contents rearranged in patterns that corresponded to diagrams in Elias's journal. The family dog, a friendly golden retriever named Buster, refused to enter the house, whining and backing away whenever they approached the door. Within a week, the Millers made the decision to leave, packing only what they needed and abandoning the farmhouse with most of their possessions still inside. The official explanation for their sudden departure was a family emergency that required their immediate return to Baltimore. David contacted the local historical society about the artifacts in the hidden room, but when representatives arrived to collect them, they found the room empty, its shelves bare and the dirt floor swept clean. The journal had vanished from David's study, despite his certainty that he had left it locked in his desk. The real estate agent who had sold them the house claimed no knowledge of any hidden room, and subsequent buyers reported nothing unusual during their brief tenure in the property. 5 years later, the Miller farmhouse burned to the ground under circumstances that the fire marshal's office could not definitively determine. Though they noted that the blaze seemed to start simultaneously in multiple locations, David and Sarah never spoke of their time in West Virginia to anyone outside their immediate family. Emily developed an intense fear of birds that persisted into adulthood. While Michael has no memory of the incident in his room or his time in West Virginia at all, David's academic research shifted away from local history to topics unrelated to his family origins, and he destroyed all photographs and documents connected to the Miller farmhouse. Sarah designed houses with open floor plans and no hidden spaces, no attics, no basements, no places where secrets might lurk behind plaster walls. The Miller family's secret, whatever its full nature might have been, remained buried in the ashes of the farmhouse and in the silent memories of those who briefly uncovered it. In the summer of 2013, Mark Peterson was cleaning out his recently deceased father's garage in suburban Minneapolis when he found a box of old reel-to-reel audio tapes. His father, Robert Peterson, had been an audio engineer for a local television station in the 1970s and 80s, and Mark assumed the tapes contained old broadcasts or personal recordings. Robert had been a quiet, reserved man who rarely spoke of his childhood or his parents, who had died when Mark was young. The relationship between father and son had been cordial, but distant, marked more by silence than conversation. Mark had always attributed this to his father's reserved nature. But as he sorted through the accumulated possessions of a lifetime, he began to wonder if there might be more to the story. The garage was a testament to his father's methodical nature tools organized by size and function, shelves labeled with precise handwriting, everything in its designated place. The box of tapes sat on a high shelf, labeled simply Family Recordings, 1967-1972, in his father's distinctive block letters. Mark almost left them for the estate sale, but something made him carry them inside. Perhaps the historian's curiosity that his father had passed down to him despite their emotional distance. Mark owned a vintage audio equipment repair shop, so he had the machines necessary to play the old tapes. That evening, after his wife and children had gone to bed, he set up the reel-to-reel player in his basement office and threaded the first tape. The quality was surprisingly clear, considering the age of the recordings. The first tape appeared to be a typical family birthday party from 1967, with children's voices, birthday wishes, and the familiar sounds of celebration. Mark recognized his father's youthful voice among the others, though it sounded lighter and more carefree than the measured tone he remembered from childhood. As the tape progressed, however, Mark noticed something unusual. Amid the normal party sounds, there were moments of whispered conversation that seemed to occur separately from the main celebration. The whispers were too faint to make out clearly, but they had a rhythmic quality that seemed deliberate. More disturbing was the presence of a child's voice that didn't seem to belong at the party. A thin, reedy voice that spoke in phrases that sounded almost like chants or prayers. Mark listened to the entire tape, growing increasingly uneasy, though he couldn't identify exactly why. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of a door slamming and a woman's sharp cry that was cut off mid-scream. Over the next week, Mark worked his way through the box of tapes. Each one followed a similar pattern: normal family events overlaid with mysterious whispers and the strange child's voice. The second tape documented a family vacation to Lake Superior, with sounds of water and children playing, but also with those unsettling undercurrents of whispered conversation and chanting. The third tape was a Christmas celebration, complete with carols and gift opening, yet beneath it all ran that same thread of ritualistic speech. What disturbed Mark most was that his father appeared to be aware of these secondary recordings, occasionally responding to the whispers or adjusting the microphone to better capture the child's voice. In one particularly chilling segment, Robert's voice could be heard saying, "It's working. The bridge is growing stronger," followed by the child's voice reciting what sounded like a series of names. Mark began to research his family history, discovering that his grandparents had been involved in a spiritualist church in the 1960s, one that had been investigated for questionable practices before ultimately disbanding amid rumors of psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. Church records listed his grandparents as founding members and his father as a participant in what were termed communication sessions. The fifth tape in the box was different from the others. It began with his father's voice speaking directly to the microphone. October 31st, 1971. Session 23. Subject remains stable but showing signs of resistance. The bridge holds. What followed was what Mark could only describe as an interrogation, with his father asking questions and receiving answers from multiple voices, some of which sounded like children, others like elderly men and women. The questions were personal and invasive, asking about memories, fears, and secrets that no one should know. The answers came in a flat, emotionless tone, as if the speakers were in a trance. At one point, a woman's voice, his grandmother, Mark realized, said, "The child must not remember. The memories must be contained." His father replied, "The containment is failing. We may need to take more drastic measures." The tape ended with a prolonged scream that gradually faded into silence, followed by his father saying, "Session terminated. Subject unresponsive. We'll try again tomorrow." Mark felt a cold dread settle over him as he realized what he was hearing: his father and grandparents conducting some kind of psychological experiment, possibly on a child, using audio recording as part of their methodology. The final tape in the box was unlabeled and recorded on a different type of reel. When Mark played it, he heard only silence for the first 3 minutes. Then came his father's voice, sounding older and more stressed than in the previous recordings. Final entry, August 14th, 1972. The experiment failed. The containment broke. I've destroyed all evidence except this one recording, as a reminder of what we did. The memories were too strong, the bridge too unstable. We thought we could control it, but it controlled us instead. Mother is in the institution, father won't speak, and I have to live with what we did to her, to all of them. If anyone finds this, destroy it. Some doors should never be opened, some bridges never built. After a moment of silence, the recording continued with what sounded like a child crying softly, then a door closing, and finally, nothing more. Mark sat in the silence of his basement for a long time, the implications of what he had heard slowly sinking in. His father's emotional distance, his reluctance to speak of his childhood, his aversion to audio recording despite his technical expertise, all of it suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. Mark's investigation into his family's past took a darker turn when he discovered old newspaper articles about a missing child from his grandparents' neighborhood in 1972. The girl, 8-year-old Emily Watson, had disappeared from her backyard on a summer afternoon and was never found. The article mentioned that Emily's parents had been members of a spiritualist group with the Petersons, but had left the church amid unspecified conflicts shortly before their daughter's disappearance. Further research revealed that Mark's grandmother had been institutionalized in 1973 and remained in care until her death in 1992. His grandfather had died in 1975, officially from a heart attack, though Mark now wondered if guilt or fear had played a role. The most disturbing discovery came when Mark found a locked box in his father's safe deposit box. Inside was a single photograph of a dark-haired little girl with a note on the back. "Emily, we're sorry. We tried to fix it, but only made it worse." Mark turned the photograph over and found another message. "Some memories are too heavy to carry. Some doors once opened can never be fully closed again." Mark never listened to the tapes again. He destroyed them, breaking the reels and burning the magnetic tape in his backyard fire pit one night when his wife and children were visiting her parents. He considered going to the police, but ultimately decided against it, reasoning that after 40 years there was little they could do and much pain it might cause. The Watsons had moved away years ago, and other members of the spiritualist group were either dead or scattered. Mark did visit his mother in the nursing home where she lived with advanced dementia, hoping for some clarity, but she barely recognized him and spoke only in fragments of memories that made no sense. He did find one moment of connection when he mentioned his father's name. Her eyes cleared for a moment, and she whispered, "The tapes? He destroyed the tapes, didn't he?" When Mark nodded, she seemed to relax, saying, "Good. Some things should stay buried." Mark sold his audio equipment shop and retrained as a counselor, working with trauma survivors. He never told his wife or children the full story of what he had discovered, though he became fiercely protective of them, almost paranoid at times. The Peterson family secret died with him when he suffered a fatal heart attack in 2019, taking the truth of those audio recordings to whatever afterlife awaits those who carry heavy secrets. The missing girl, Emily Watson, was never found. Her case eventually transferred to the cold file unit, where it remains among the thousands of unsolved disappearances that haunt the American landscape. It was early spring of 2015 when Jennifer Harrington found the wooden crate in her grandmother's attic. The house in coastal Maine had been in her family for over a century, and her grandmother Eleanor, who had passed away at 96, had accumulated a lifetime of possessions. Jennifer was helping her mother sort through the contents, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to discard. The crate was unremarkable dark wood, slightly warped from years of humidity, with no identifying marks except for a series of dates stenciled on the side: 1923, 1947, 1968, 1989, 2010. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, were dozens of photograph albums, each one labeled with a family name and a year. Jennifer, who worked as a photo archivist at a local museum, was immediately intrigued. Her family had always been avid photographers, but these albums looked different from the family photos she had seen before. The paper was thick and yellowed with age, the binding hand-stitched, and the photographs themselves had a strange quality, almost three-dimensional, with an unusual depth that made the subjects seem to stand out from their backgrounds. As Jennifer carefully examined the first album, dated 1923, she felt a growing sense of unease. The photographs showed family gatherings, holidays, and everyday scenes, but something about them was wrong. The first album, from 1923, contained photographs of Jennifer's great-grandparents and their 3 young children. At first glance, they appeared to be typical family portraits of the era: formal poses, solemn expressions, period clothing. But as Jennifer studied them more closely, she noticed disturbing details. In one photograph, her great-grandfather stood with his hand on his son's shoulder, but the shadow cast by his hand didn't match the position of his arm. In another, her great-grandmother was captured mid-step, her dress flowing behind her, but her feet appeared to be several inches above the ground. Most unsettling was a photograph of the 3 children playing in a garden. In the image, the youngest child, a boy of perhaps 5, was looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed almost adult in its knowingness. Behind him, barely visible among the flowers, was a dark shape that resembled a human figure, but was somehow indistinct, as if vibrating at a frequency that the camera could barely capture. Jennifer felt a chill despite the warmth of the attic. She attributed her reaction to overwork and her recent grief over her grandmother's passing, closing the album and moving on to other tasks. The next day, Jennifer returned to the attic alone, drawn by a need to understand the strange photographs. The second album, dated 1947, contained images of her grandparents as a young couple with their 2 children, Jennifer's mother and her uncle. Like the earlier album, these photographs initially appeared normal, but revealed disturbing anomalies upon closer inspection. In a Christmas scene, the family gathered around a tree, but the reflection in the ornament hanging from a branch showed an extra person who wasn't visible in the main image. In a beach photograph, her grandfather stood with his footprints clearly visible in the sand behind him. Yet he appeared to be walking forward without leaving any new prints. Most disturbing was a photograph of her mother as a child, perhaps 7 years old, standing alone in a hallway. Behind her, multiple doors were visible, each one slightly ajar. In the reflection of a mirror at the end of the hall, Jennifer could see her mother as she appeared in the photograph, but also another figure standing just behind her, a tall, thin shape with no discernible features. Jennifer took the album home, telling her mother she wanted to digitize the images before they deteriorated further. That night, she scanned several of the photographs, enlarging them on her computer screen to examine the details more closely. As she zoomed in on the image of her mother in the hallway, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the mirror's reflection, the figure behind her mother seemed to be looking directly at the camera, its featureless face somehow conveying an expression of malevolent awareness. Jennifer's research into the photographs took a more urgent turn when she discovered that the dates on the albums corresponded to significant events in her family's history. In 1923, her great-grandfather's brother had died under mysterious circumstances, apparently drowning in a pond on the family property despite being a strong swimmer. In 1947, her grandparents' first child had died of sudden infant death syndrome at only 3 months old. In 1968, her uncle had been killed in a car accident on his 18th birthday. In 1989, her aunt had disappeared while hiking in the nearby woods and was never found. And in 2010, her grandfather had died of a rapid-onset illness that doctors had been unable to diagnose. The pattern was unmistakable. Each album preceded a family tragedy by approximately 6 months. Jennifer remembered her grandmother saying once that the family had a darkness that followed them. But Jennifer had assumed she was speaking metaphorically about bad luck or poor health. Now, she wondered if her grandmother had meant something more literal. The final album, dated 2010, contained photographs of family gatherings from before her grandfather's death. In one image, her grandfather stood in the garden, looking directly at the camera with an expression of profound sadness. Behind him, barely visible among the trees, was the same dark shape that Jennifer had seen in the 1923 photographs. But this time, it seemed closer, more defined. The escalation came when Jennifer found a small key hidden in the lining of the 2010 album. The key opened a locked drawer in her grandmother's desk, where Jennifer discovered a journal written in her grandmother's elegant script. The entries began in 1923, when Eleanor was a child, and continued regularly until just a few weeks before her death. The journal revealed a terrifying family tradition that had been passed down through the generations of Harrington women. Each woman, when she came of age, was initiated into the secret of the photographs, a method of capturing images that went beyond ordinary photography. According to Eleanor's writings, the technique had been developed by Jennifer's great-great-grandmother, who had discovered that certain chemical processes and photographic techniques could capture not just images, but something more, a presence that attached itself to the family. The photographs served as warnings, allowing the family to see the approach of what Eleanor called the shadow, an entity that brought death to the family with each generational cycle. The women of the family were responsible for taking the photographs and interpreting the signs, though they were powerless to prevent what they predicted. "We see it coming," Eleanor wrote in 1968, "but we cannot stop it. We can only document its approach and prepare ourselves for the inevitable." Jennifer's discovery coincided with a series of disturbing events in her own life. Objects in her apartment moved when she wasn't looking, though she initially dismissed this as forgetfulness. She began waking up to find photographs turned face down on her nightstand, though she was certain she had left them upright. Most alarming was the appearance of new photographs in her camera images she hadn't taken, showing empty rooms in her apartment with the same dark shape barely visible in corners or reflections. Jennifer remembered her grandmother telling her once that the family gift and curse would pass to her when Eleanor was gone. But Jennifer had assumed she was speaking about her photographic talent. Now, she understood that her grandmother had been preparing her for a legacy she couldn't have imagined. The most terrifying realization came when Jennifer calculated the dates of the previous tragedies and realized that the next 6-month interval would end in late fall of 2015. With a cold certainty that settled in her bones like ice, Jennifer knew that the shadow was coming for someone in her generation. Jennifer's sister, Rachel, was pregnant with her first child, due in November. As Jennifer's fear grew, she tried to explain what she had discovered, but Rachel dismissed her concerns as grief-induced paranoia. Their mother, when Jennifer cautiously approached her, became agitated and refused to discuss the matter, though Jennifer noticed the fear in her eyes. With no one to turn to, Jennifer returned to her grandmother's journal, searching for any mention of how to break the cycle. She found a single entry written in the final weeks of Eleanor's life. "Jennifer will be the last. The camera can be turned away, the photographs can be destroyed. The shadow feeds on attention, on documentation. Without the photographs, it grows weaker. I should have done it years ago. But the tradition was strong, the fear of what might happen if we stopped greater than the fear of what happened when we continued. Jennifer, if you read this, destroy the albums. Break the cycle. Let the shadow starve." Jennifer gathered all the albums from the attic and burned them in her fireplace, watching as the strange photographs curled and blackened, the images of her family and the shadow that haunted them turning to ash. She destroyed her own camera and deleted all digital images from her computer and phone. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. The disturbances stopped, and Jennifer began to hope that she had succeeded. In October 2015, Jennifer's sister gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Jennifer visited the hospital, feeling a sense of relief that the cycle had been broken. As she held her newborn niece, she took out her phone to capture the moment, then remembered herself and put it away, content to simply experience the moment without documenting it. When she returned home that evening, she found a package on her doorstep. No return address, no postage, just her name written on the brown paper wrapping in handwriting that looked remarkably like her grandmother's. Inside was a new photograph album, this one with a single date on the cover, 2015. With trembling hands, Jennifer opened it to find a single photograph on the first page, an image of her holding her newborn niece in the hospital room. Behind her, barely visible in the reflection of the window, was a dark shape, taller and more defined than ever before, its featureless face somehow conveying an expression of triumph. Jennifer Harrington disappeared 3 days later, leaving behind a note that simply said, "I have to go away for a while. Don't look for me." Her car was found abandoned at a trailhead in the nearby woods. The driver's door open, the engine still running. No trace was ever found. It was mid-July of 2016 when Thomas Blackwood returned to his family's ancestral home in the desert of southern Arizona. Thomas had been living in Phoenix, working as a software engineer, trying to distance himself from the strange traditions and beliefs that had dominated his childhood. His mother's death had brought him back to the isolated adobe house that had been in his family for over 200 years, not as a beloved inheritance, but as a burden he couldn't escape. The Blackwood family had always been outsiders in the community, keeping to themselves and maintaining practices that their neighbors found peculiar at best and disturbing at worst. Thomas had escaped as soon as he could, attending college on the East Coast and building a life that had nothing to do with the desert or his family's history. Now, at 35, he found himself responsible for the property and its contents, including whatever secrets it held. The house stood alone in the vast desert landscape, its thick walls weathered to the color of the surrounding earth, its windows like dark eyes watching the horizon. Thomas had intended to sell the property as quickly as possible, but as he stood in the courtyard, surrounded by the silence and the oppressive heat, he felt the pull of something he couldn't name, something that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. The first night in the house was sleepless. Thomas found himself wandering through the rooms, touching objects that had remained unchanged since his childhood. The house was a museum of his family's peculiar traditions, shelves lined with jars containing herbs and minerals, walls adorned with strange symbols painted in pigments that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Furniture arranged in patterns that created what his mother had called energy channels. In the main living room, Thomas found a large leather-bound book on a wooden stand, its pages filled with handwritten entries spanning generations. The book was what his family called the record, a detailed account of births, deaths, marriages, and other significant events in the Blackwood lineage. As Thomas flipped through the pages, he noticed something disturbing, a pattern of premature deaths, accidents, and misfortunes that seemed to affect every third generation of Blackwoods. His own generation was the third in the current cycle, and according to the entries, several of his cousins had already died under unusual circumstances. Thomas remembered his mother speaking of the reckoning that came with each third generation, but he had dismissed it as superstition, part of the elaborate fantasy world that his family inhabited. Now, as he read the detailed accounts of previous reckonings, he felt a growing dread that had nothing to do with grief or nostalgia. Thomas's investigation into his family's history took a more urgent turn when he discovered a hidden room behind a bookshelf in his mother's bedroom. The room was small, windowless, and painted entirely black, with a single wooden table in the center. On the table lay a series of photographs, each showing a Blackwood family member from previous third generations. What chilled Thomas was that in every photograph, the subject's eyes had been cut out, leaving empty white spaces that seemed to stare back at him. Beneath the photographs was a folder containing documents related to a family tradition called the offering. According to these documents, every third generation, the Blackwoods were required to make a sacrifice to what they called the desert spirit, an entity that had supposedly made a pact with Thomas's ancestor in the 1800s, granting the family prosperity and protection in exchange for periodic offerings. The offerings were not of animals or material possessions, but of family members, chosen by a complex system of divination that involved astrology, numerology, and other esoteric practices. The chosen ones would disappear, and the family would prosper for another 2 generations before the cycle began again. Thomas felt a wave of nausea as he realized that his mother had been preparing for this reckoning for years, and that her death from a sudden, aggressive form of cancer might have been part of the pattern rather than a random tragedy. The disturbances began subtly. Thomas would hear whispers in the night, though the house was empty and the windows sealed against any outside sounds. He would find objects moved from where he had placed them, arranged in patterns that matched the symbols painted on the walls. Most disturbing were the appearances of what looked like handprints in the dust on surfaces that no one had touched, small, delicate prints that seemed to belong to a child. Thomas remembered his mother telling him stories about the desert children, spirits that supposedly helped the Blackwoods communicate with the entity they served. As a child, Thomas had dismissed these stories as fantasies, but now he wondered if there was some truth to them. The heat of the desert seemed to intensify, pressing against the thick walls of the house, making the air inside feel heavy and difficult to breathe. Thomas found himself drinking more water than usual, yet always feeling thirsty, his skin dry and tight despite the lotion he applied. He began to sleep during the day and stay awake at night, as if his internal clock was slowly reversing itself to match the rhythm of the desert. The escalation came when Thomas found a new photograph on the table in the hidden room. It was a recent image of himself, taken without his knowledge, showing him standing in the courtyard of the house. Like the other photographs, his eyes had been cut out, leaving those disturbing white spaces. Beneath the photograph was a note written in his mother's handwriting. "You're next, my son. The desert has chosen you. Don't fight it. It's an honor to serve the family in this way." Thomas felt a cold terror grip him as he realized what this meant. His mother had identified him as the next offering, and her death had perhaps been a way to spare him this fate, or perhaps to prepare him for it. He remembered her strange behavior in the months before her death, the rituals she performed, the conversations she had with empty chairs, the way she would sometimes look at him with an expression that was both loving and sorrowful. At the time, Thomas had attributed these behaviors to her illness and the medication she was taking. But now he wondered if she had been trying to communicate something important. Something about the family secret that he was only now beginning to understand. Thomas's attempts to leave the property were met with inexplicable obstacles. His car wouldn't start, though it had been working perfectly the day before. The roads leading away from the house seemed to shift and change, taking him in circles when he tried to walk out. The heat intensified to an almost unbearable degree, as if the desert itself was preventing his departure. Thomas felt his resolve weakening, his thoughts becoming confused, his sense of reality blurring at the edges. He found himself performing rituals he didn't remember learning, speaking words in a language he didn't recognize, arranging objects in patterns that felt both alien and familiar. The desert children seemed to be more present now, their laughter echoing in empty rooms, their small footprints appearing in the dust that settled on every surface. Thomas began to understand that his mother hadn't been trying to spare him from the offering, but had been preparing him for it, initiating him into the family tradition without his knowledge. The cancer that had taken her life might have been self-induced, a final act of devotion to the entity that had protected and haunted the Blackwood family for generations. In early August, Thomas's sister, Rebecca, became concerned when she couldn't reach him by phone. She drove from Phoenix to the family home, finding the house empty but showing signs of recent occupation, a half-empty glass of water on the kitchen counter, clothes laid out on a bed, a book open on a table with a single passage underlined. "The desert gives, and the desert takes away. What belongs to the desert must return to the desert." Rebecca searched the property, calling her brother's name until her voice grew hoarse, but there was no response. In the hidden room behind the bookshelf, she found the photographs and documents that Thomas had discovered. Along with a new addition, a photograph of Thomas standing in the desert at sunset, his arms outstretched as if in welcome or surrender. Like the others, his eyes had been cut out. But beneath this photograph was a note in Thomas's handwriting. "I understand now. It's not an ending, but a transformation. The desert calls, and I must answer. Tell the others that the pact continues, that the family will prosper for another 2 generations. Don't mourn for me. I'm where I'm meant to be. Rebecca called the sheriff's department, but despite an extensive search, no trace of Thomas was ever found. The Blackwood family home was sold to a developer who planned to turn it into a luxury retreat. Though construction was repeatedly delayed by unusual problems, equipment malfunctions, workers quitting without explanation, and a series of strange accidents that eventually caused the project to be abandoned. The house stands empty to this day, a monument to a family secret that continues to guard itself, waiting for the next reckoning in 2 generations' time. It was late November of 2017 when park ranger Daniel Morales discovered the abandoned Wallace family vehicle on a remote road in Denali National Park, Alaska. The Wallace family, James, Sarah, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Noah, had been reported missing 10 days earlier when they failed to return from what was supposed to be a weekend camping trip. Their vehicle, a silver SUV, was found approximately 50 miles from the nearest ranger station, parked on the shoulder of a little-used maintenance road, with no signs of damage or mechanical failure. The keys were in the ignition, though the engine was cold and the gas tank was nearly full. Inside the vehicle, Morales found camping equipment, food supplies, and personal belongings, all seemingly in order. What was unusual was the absence of any tracks leading away from the vehicle, no footprints in the thin layer of snow that covered the ground, no signs that the family had walked away from their car. The doors were unlocked, and a half-eaten bag of chips sat on the front passenger seat, as if someone had been snacking just moments before the vehicle was abandoned. Morales called in the discovery, initiating what would become one of the most baffling missing persons cases in Alaska's history. The investigation into the Wallace family's disappearance revealed few clues. James Wallace was a geologist who had worked in Alaska for 5 years, and his family had joined him 6 months earlier after he accepted a permanent position with a mining company. Sarah Wallace was a freelance writer working on a book about frontier life, and both children were enrolled in the local elementary school. Friends and co-workers described the Wallaces as a close-knit family who enjoyed outdoor activities but were experienced and cautious when it came to wilderness excursions. The camping trip they had embarked on was to a location they had visited before, a small lake approximately 20 miles from where their vehicle was found. Search and rescue teams combed the area, but found no signs of the family, no footprints, no abandoned campsite, no evidence of struggle or distress. The weather during the period of their disappearance had been unusually mild for late November in Alaska, with no storms or extreme temperature drops that might explain a sudden disappearance. The most puzzling aspect of the case was the location of their vehicle nearly 30 miles off their planned route, on a road that led deeper into the wilderness rather than toward civilization. The breakthrough in the case came 2 weeks after the initial discovery, when a hiker found a notebook in a small clearing approximately 5 miles from where the Wallace vehicle had been abandoned. The notebook belonged to James Wallace, and its entries provided a chilling account of the family's final days. The first entries, dated the weekend the family was supposed to return, described a successful camping trip with plans to head home the following morning. The next entry, dated 2 days later, told a different story. James wrote that the family had become disoriented while hiking and had taken what they thought was a shortcut back to their vehicle. Instead, they had found themselves in an unfamiliar area of the park, surrounded by terrain that didn't match any of their maps. As darkness fell, they had made camp and hoped to find their way back in the morning. The subsequent entries grew increasingly strange. James wrote of hearing voices in the night, of seeing lights moving through the forest that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena, and of a growing sense that they were being watched by something that remained just out of sight. Sarah, he wrote, had become increasingly agitated, insisting that they were being led in circles by an unseen force. The final entries in James Wallace's notebook took a more disturbing turn. He wrote of discovering what appeared to be a small structure deep in the wilderness, a building made of dark wood that seemed older than the surrounding forest, though no records indicated any such structure in that area. The family had approached the building, hoping to find shelter or assistance, but found it empty except for a series of strange symbols carved into the walls and floor. James wrote that the symbols seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, forming patterns that made his head ache and his vision blur. Sarah had become convinced that the building was some kind of trap, urging the family to leave immediately. But James had been compelled to explore further, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't explain. The last coherent entry read, "The symbols tell a story. They speak of a trade life for knowledge, presence for absence. The children are frightened. Sarah wants to leave, but I feel we're close to understanding something important. The air grows thick. Something approaches." The notebook ended there, with a final page containing only a series of symbols similar to those found in the mysterious building. The investigation took a darker turn when search teams located the building described in James Wallace's notebook. The structure, approximately 20 by 30 feet, was indeed made of dark wood that appeared to be ancient, though tree ring analysis later dated it to no more than 10 years old. Inside, investigators found the symbols James had described, carved into every surface with a precision that suggested sophisticated tools. What was most disturbing was the discovery of several other notebooks in a wooden box in the center of the room. These notebooks, like James's, contained accounts of families or individuals who had become lost in the area and had stumbled upon the building. Each story followed a similar pattern: disorientation, strange phenomena, discovery of the building, fascination with the symbols, and eventual disappearance. The earliest notebook dated back to 1982, with others appearing at irregular intervals over the next 35 years. All described similar experiences: hearing voices, seeing lights, feeling watched by an unseen presence. Most chilling was the fact that each notebook ended with either the same symbols found on the walls or with a statement about the trade or the exchange. Investigators also discovered that several of the people who had written these notebooks were among Alaska's long-term missing persons cases, their disappearances never solved until now. The mystery deepened when forensic analysis of the notebooks and building revealed something extraordinary. The wood used in the construction of the building came from trees that had been dead for at least 50 years. Yet the structure itself showed no signs of aging or weathering. The symbols carved into the walls contained microscopic traces of minerals not native to Alaska, suggesting they had been created by someone with access to specialized materials. Most disturbing was the discovery of human DNA on several surfaces in the building DNA that matched not only the Wallace family, but also several of the other missing individuals whose notebooks were found. What was strange about the DNA evidence was its distribution, rather than being concentrated in areas where people might naturally touch. It was spread in patterns that matched the symbols on the walls, as if people had deliberately applied their genetic material to the carvings. Investigators also found small amounts of a rare plant that had psychoactive properties, suggesting that those who entered the building might have been under the influence of a mind-altering substance. Yet no traces of this plant were found in the immediate area around the building, raising questions about how it got there. The Wallace family case was officially closed after 6 months of investigation, with the conclusion that the family had likely succumbed to exposure after becoming lost in the wilderness. The building and its contents were classified as part of an ongoing investigation into unspecified criminal activities. and the area where it was found was restricted to the public. Privately, however, several of the investigators involved in the case believed they had encountered something beyond their understanding or ability to explain. Ranger Daniel Morales, who had discovered the Wallace vehicle, requested a transfer to a different park shortly after the case closed, citing personal reasons. In his transfer request, he wrote that he had experienced unusual phenomena while working in the area and felt uneasy about returning. Other members of the search and rescue team reported similar experiences: strange lights in the sky, equipment malfunctions, and a persistent feeling of being watched. One ranger claimed to have heard children's laughter while searching near the building, though no children were present in the area. The building itself was dismantled and removed from the site, though the symbols on the walls were documented before its destruction. Microscopic analysis of the carvings revealed what appeared to be layers of symbols beneath the visible ones, suggesting that the markings had been added to repeatedly over time, each new layer incorporating elements of the previous ones. 3 years after the Wallace family disappearance, a hiker found a child's drawing in a plastic bag pinned to a tree near where the mysterious building had stood. The drawing, crudely done in crayon, showed 4 figures: a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing before a structure that resembled the building described in James Wallace's notebook. Above the structure was a series of symbols similar to those found carved into its walls. What was most disturbing about the drawing was the addition of 4 new figures standing behind the original family's shadowy shapes with no distinct features, as if they were reflections or shadows cast by an unseen light. The drawing was taken to the local authorities, who confirmed that it was likely the work of Lily Wallace, based on comparison with other drawings found in the family's home. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Had Lily returned to the area briefly to leave the drawing? Or had it been there all along, unnoticed during the initial investigation? And what did the shadowy figures represent? The Wallace family was never found, their disappearance joining the ranks of Alaska's unsolved mysteries. The official explanation remains that they succumbed to the elements after becoming lost. But those who worked on the case know that the truth, if it was ever known, was lost somewhere in the vast wilderness of Denali, along with a family who ventured too far into the unknown and never returned. It was early April of 2018 when attorney Marcus Chen contacted Emily Montgomery about her great-aunt Elizabeth's estate. Emily had met Elizabeth only a few times as a child, elderly, severe, and living in isolation in the small town of Black Creek, Oregon. Elizabeth had died at 93, leaving no immediate family except for Emily's branch of the Montgomery clan. The inheritance consisted primarily of Elizabeth's Victorian house, which had been in the Montgomery family for generations, along with its contents. Emily, a recent architecture school graduate, saw an opportunity to acquire her first home and potentially launch a renovation business. She traveled to Black Creek with her partner, Alex, planning to spend a weekend assessing the property before making decisions about its future. The house stood on a hill overlooking the town, its paint peeling, its windows like vacant eyes, its porch sagging under the weight of years. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, every surface covered with a layer of grime that spoke of long neglect. Yet beneath the dirt and disrepair, Emily could see the craftsmanship and character that had once made the house a showplace. As they explored room after room, Emily and Alex felt a growing excitement about the possibilities, imagining how the house might look restored to its former glory. The discovery happened on the second day, as Emily and Alex were measuring the master bedroom for potential renovations. Alex noticed that one section of the wall sounded hollow when tapped, and upon further investigation, they found what appeared to be a sealed doorway hidden behind layers of wallpaper and plaster. With careful work, They uncovered a small door, approximately 5 feet high, with an ornate brass handle. There was no lock, but the door was stuck shut, and it took both of their combined strength to pull it open. The space beyond was not a typical closet or storage area, but a narrow corridor that led to a small room, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, with no windows and walls lined with shelves. The shelves held dozens of identical leather-bound books, each one labeled with a name and a date range. In the center of the room stood a wooden table with a single leather-bound book lying open, its pages filled with handwritten entries. Emily recognized the handwriting as belonging to her great-aunt Elizabeth. The air in the room was strangely still and cool, despite the warmth of the spring day outside, and the silence seemed deeper, more absolute than in the rest of the house. As Emily approached the table, she felt a sense of unease that she couldn't quite explain, a feeling that she was intruding on something private and perhaps dangerous. The book on the table was what Elizabeth had called the Record, a detailed account of the Montgomery family's strange tradition. According to Elizabeth's writings, every Montgomery family home contained a similar hidden room, and within each room, records of the family's guardians, individuals chosen to protect the family from a darkness that had plagued them for generations. The guardians were not volunteers, but were selected through a complex system that involved astrology, numerology, and other esoteric practices. Once chosen, a guardian would serve for life, living in isolation within the family home, maintaining rituals and practices that kept the darkness at bay. In return for their service, guardians were provided for financially, but were forbidden from marrying, having children, or forming close relationships outside the family. Elizabeth herself had been a guardian for over 60 years, having been chosen as a young woman when her predecessor, Emily's great-grandmother, had died. What disturbed Emily most was Elizabeth's description of the darkness the guardians protected against an entity she called the Hollow Man, a presence that attached itself to the Montgomery family and brought misfortune, madness, and death when not properly contained. Elizabeth wrote that the Hollow Man could not be destroyed, but could be kept dormant through specific rituals performed by the guardians in the hidden rooms. Emily's investigation into her family's history took a more urgent turn when she examined the other books on the shelves. Each one contained the records of a previous guardian, dating back to the early 1800s. As she read through the accounts, Emily noticed a disturbing pattern. Each guardian described similar experiences: hearing whispers in empty rooms, seeing shadowy figures at the edges of their vision, feeling a persistent coldness that seemed to emanate from the walls of the hidden room. More troubling were the entries that described what happened when the rituals failed or were neglected, periods of intensified paranormal activity, followed by tragedy in the family. Emily remembered stories she had heard as a child about various Montgomery family members who had suffered mental breakdowns, committed suicide, or died under unusual circumstances. At the time, these stories had seemed like random tragedies. But now Emily wondered if they were connected to the family secret, manifestations of the Hollow Man when the guardian's protection wavered. The most chilling discovery came when Emily found a photograph hidden in the back of Elizabeth's book. It showed a group of people standing before the Montgomery house, their faces blurred as if they were moving during the exposure. What was disturbing was that in the photograph, taken in the 1920s, the figures appeared to be transparent, as if they were ghosts or reflections rather than solid people. The disturbances began subtly. Emily and Alex would hear footsteps in the house when they were alone, though the floors made no sound when they walked. Objects would move from where they were placed, only to reappear in inexplicable locations. Doors would open and close on their own, particularly the door to the hidden room, which no amount of securing could keep closed. Alex, ever the rationalist, attempted to explain these occurrences as the natural result of an old house settling or their own overactive imaginations. Emily, however, found herself increasingly drawn to the hidden room and its records. Spending hours reading through the accounts of previous guardians and trying to understand the rituals they had performed, she began to experience vivid dreams in which she walked through the house at night, performing strange ceremonies and speaking words she didn't recognize. In these dreams, she felt a sense of purpose and connection to something larger than herself, though upon waking, she could only remember fragments, symbols on the walls, whispered words, the feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. Emily found herself changing, becoming more withdrawn and secretive, spending hours alone in the hidden rooms while Alex worked on other parts of the house. The escalation came in late May, as Emily and Alex prepared to return to their home in Portland. Emily had decided to keep the house and renovate it gradually, planning to move in permanently once the work was completed. Alex had reservations but supported her decision, though he was concerned about her increasing preoccupation with the family history and the hidden room. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Emily woke to find herself standing in the hidden room, holding one of the Guardian books and speaking words in a language she didn't recognize. The door to the room was open, and standing in the doorway was a figure, a tall, thin shape with no discernible features, like a silhouette cut from darkness. Emily felt no fear, only a strange sense of recognition, as if she was meeting someone she had known her entire life. The figure raised what might have been a hand and pointed at Emily, then at the book in her hands, then at the empty shelves along the wall. Emily understood without words what was being asked of her. She was to become the next guardian, taking up the duty that her great-aunt had performed for so many years. As the figure faded back into the darkness of the corridor, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her, as if a question she hadn't known she was asking had finally been answered. Alex found Emily in the hidden room the next morning, sitting cross-legged on the floor with the Guardian books arranged in a circle around her. She was humming softly, her eyes closed, her expression serene. When Alex tried to speak to her, she didn't respond, though her eyes opened and she looked at him without recognition. Alex called for help, and Emily was taken to a hospital in Portland, where doctors diagnosed her with a rare form of dissociative disorder. She spoke only in fragments, mostly repeating words and phrases from the Guardian books or conversing with someone who wasn't there. Alex sold the Montgomery house, unable to bear the thought of returning to it. The new owners, a couple from California, renovated the property and converted it into a bed and breakfast. They reported some unusual occurrences, doors opening on their own, unexplained cold spots, guests complaining of whispers in empty rooms, but nothing that couldn't be attributed to the quirks of an old house. They never discovered the hidden room, which had been sealed during the renovation, its entrance concealed behind a newly constructed wall. Emily Montgomery remained in institutional care for the rest of her life, never fully recovering from whatever she had experienced in that house. She continued to speak of the hollow man and her duty as guardian, though her words were dismissed as symptoms of her condition. In the rare moments of clarity, she would sometimes ask about the house and whether the protection was still being maintained. No one knew what she meant, and no one could answer her question. The Montgomery family secret died with her, though the hollow man, if it ever existed, remains dormant in the walls of that Victorian house in Black Creek, waiting for the next guardian to take up the duty. It was early September of 2019 when genealogist Dr. Richard Sullivan made a disturbing discovery while researching his family history. Richard had been working on his family tree for over 20 years, a hobby that had grown into an academic pursuit. As a professor of history at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, he had access to resources that allowed him to trace his lineage back further than most amateur genealogists. The Sullivan family had been in America since the colonial era, with records indicating that Richard's ancestors had settled in Massachusetts in the 1630s. For the most part, the family history was unremarkable: farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, and eventually, professionals like himself. What had always intrigued Richard, however, was a pattern of unusual deaths and disappearances that seemed to occur every third generation, affecting primarily the male members of the family. At first, he had attributed this pattern to coincidence or the natural hazards of earlier eras. But as his research grew more detailed, he began to suspect that something more deliberate was at play. The discovery that would change his understanding of his family came in the form of a letter written in 1878 by his great-great-granduncle, Thomas Sullivan, to his brother, Richard's great-great-grandfather. The letter, found in a collection of family documents donated to a local historical society, contained a warning that Thomas had written shortly before his death at the age of 32. "The pattern continues," Thomas wrote, "as it did with our grandfather and his father before him, so it comes for me. I have seen the signs, the dreams, the reflections, the feeling of being followed by something that has no face. Mother says it is the Sullivan curse, that we pay for what our ancestor did in the old country. Father says it is madness, that we are prone to melancholia and imagination. I say it is real, and it comes for every third generation unless the sacrifice is made." The letter went on to describe a family tradition that Thomas called the renewal, a ritual performed by the third-generation males to spare themselves and their descendants from what he termed the shadow. According to Thomas, the ritual involved a journey to a specific location, the offering of a personal object, and the recitation of words that had been passed down through generations. Thomas wrote that he had refused to perform the ritual, believing it to be superstition, but that as the signs had intensified, he had begun to reconsider. The letter ended abruptly with the words, "It grows stronger. I feel it even now. If you read this, brother, perform the ritual for yourself and for your sons. Do not let pride or reason prevent you from doing what must be done." Richard's investigation into his family's curse took a more urgent turn when he cross-referenced Thomas's letter with other family documents and historical records. He discovered that every third generation of Sullivan males had indeed experienced unusual phenomena before meeting untimely ends. His great-grandfather had died in a mysterious fire at the age of 34. His grandfather had drowned at 33, and his own father had been killed in a car accident at 35. What was most disturbing was the discovery that each of these men had left behind documents similar to Thomas's letter, describing strange dreams, seeing their reflections move independently, and feeling pursued by an unseen presence. Richard also found evidence of the ritual Thomas had described, references to the renewal in various family journals, photographs of Sullivan men standing before unusual landmarks, and even a small box containing what appeared to be ritual objects: a silver knife, a leather pouch containing herbs, and a handwritten list of instructions. Richard had always been a rational man, a scientist who believed in evidence and logical explanations, but the pattern was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The most unsettling realization came when he calculated his own age and position in the generational cycle. He was 33, a third-generation Sullivan male, and according to the pattern, the next target of whatever had haunted his family for centuries. The phenomena began subtly. Richard would sometimes see movement in his peripheral vision, though when he turned to look, nothing was there. He experienced vivid dreams in which he walked through familiar places that were somehow wrong doors where there should be walls, windows that showed landscapes he had never seen, people with faces that were just slightly blurred, as if out of focus. Most disturbing were the encounters with his own reflection. Several times, he caught sight of himself in mirrors or windows, and saw his image do something he wasn't doing. Smile when he was frowning, turn away when he was looking directly at the glass, or simply stand still when he was in motion. At first, Richard attributed these experiences to stress or overwork. But as they became more frequent and more intense, he began to fear that there was truth to his family's warnings. His wife, Susan, noticed his increasing agitation and sleeplessness. Though Richard tried to hide the full extent of his experiences from her, he found himself drawn to the box of ritual objects, examining the silver knife and the list of instructions as if considering whether to perform the renewal that his ancestors had described. The rational part of his mind resisted what he saw as superstition. But another part, a deeper, more instinctual part, whispered that perhaps there were things in the world that couldn't be explained by science or logic. The escalation came in October, as Richard's experiences became more intense and more difficult to ignore. He began to hear whispers when he was alone, though he could never make out the words clearly. Objects in his home would move when he wasn't looking. Though he initially dismissed this as forgetfulness, most alarming was the appearance of what looked like footprints in the dust or snow around his house, footprints that didn't match any shoe he owned, that sometimes appeared in places where no one could have walked, such as windowsills or the roof. Richard found himself becoming increasingly paranoid, checking locks multiple times, avoiding mirrors, and jumping at every unexpected sound. His work suffered, his relationships with colleagues and students became strained, and his marriage grew tense as Susan struggled to understand what was happening to him. Richard tried to explain his experiences, but how could he describe something he barely understood himself? "I feel like I'm being haunted by my own genetics," he told his therapist, who suggested that Richard might be experiencing a form of inherited PTSD or anxiety disorder. Richard agreed to try medication, but even as he took the pills, he felt that they were treating the symptoms rather than the cause of what was happening to him. In early November, Richard made a decision that would change everything. After another night of terrifying dreams and another day of seeing his reflection move independently, he packed a bag with the ritual objects and drove to the location described in his ancestors' documents, a remote area in the mountains of northern Vermont, where a series of stone circles stood, their origin and purpose unknown to archaeologists. Richard had visited the site once before as a graduate student, dismissing it as an interesting geological formation. Now, as he stood among the ancient stones, he felt a sense of recognition, as if he was returning to a place he had known in another lifetime. Following the instructions in the ritual box, he waited until sunset, then placed the silver knife on the central stone, scattered the herbs from the leather pouch, and began to recite the words that had been passed down through generations of Sullivan men. As he spoke, he felt a strange sensation, as if something was being drawn out of him, leaving him lighter, but also somehow diminished. The air grew cold, and the shadows among the stones seemed to deepen and take on form. Richard felt a presence behind him, though when he turned, nothing was there. He completed the ritual, gathered the objects, and returned to his car, feeling exhausted but strangely at peace. The following morning, Richard woke in his own bed with no memory of how he had gotten home. The ritual objects were gone, and when he searched for them, he found that the box containing them had vanished from his study. The phenomena that had plagued him for weeks had ceased. No more whispers, no more moving objects, no more reflections that acted independently. Richard felt a profound sense of relief, though also a nagging feeling that something was missing, as if a part of himself had been removed along with whatever had haunted him. His life gradually returned to normal, though he found himself more thoughtful, more attuned to the mysteries that lay beyond the reach of academic inquiry. Susan noticed the change in him, his calmness, his occasional pensiveness, his reluctance to discuss what had happened or where he had gone that night in November. Richard's research into his family history continued, but with a new perspective, one that acknowledged the limitations of rational explanation. He never spoke of the renewal to anyone outside his immediate family, though he documented his experience in a sealed letter to be opened by his own son, should he reach the age of 33 and begin to experience similar phenomena. The Sullivan family's secret became not a burden to be feared, but a responsibility to be managed, a tradition to be maintained for the sake of future generations. Richard Sullivan lived to the age of 87, dying peacefully in his sleep, free from the pattern that had claimed so many of his ancestors. The curse, if it ever was a curse, had been broken, or perhaps more accurately, passed on to the next generation, along with the knowledge of how to keep it at bay. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, not just in its physical dimensions, but in the psychological territories that families navigate behind closed doors. The 7 stories we've explored tonight represent different facets of family secrets, the inherited trauma, the hidden histories, the unspoken agreements that shape generations. What becomes clear is that secrets, like matter, cannot be destroyed, but only transformed, changing form as they pass from one generation to the next. The Miller family's hidden room, the Petersons' audio recordings, the Harringtons' photographs, the Blackwood's desert rituals, the Wallace's disappearance, the Montgomery's inheritance, and the Chen's curse all represent different ways that families contain what cannot be expressed, what cannot be integrated into the narrative of ordinary life. These secrets fester in the darkness of silence, growing more potent with each passing year, until they demand to be acknowledged, often in ways that disrupt the carefully constructed facades of normalcy. What connects these disparate accounts is the human need to contain what we cannot understand, to create structures physical, psychological, or spiritual that hold the uncontainable. The hidden rooms, the sealed boxes, the encoded journals, the ritual practices all represent attempts to manage the unmanageable, to create boundaries between the known and the unknown. Yet these boundaries are always permeable, always at risk of being breached by the very forces they were designed to contain. The family secret is perhaps the most powerful of all mysteries because it is simultaneously intimate and universal, personal and archetypal. Each family has its shadows, its unspoken truths, its patterns of behavior that defy rational explanation. What varies is not the existence of these secrets, but how families choose to contain them through denial, through ritual, through documentation, or through silence itself. The stories we've explored tonight demonstrate that secrets have agency, that they exert their own influence on the lives of those who carry them, whether consciously or unconsciously. The American landscape is dotted with these hidden histories, with houses that contain rooms no one speaks of, with families that carry burdens no one acknowledges. The Miller farmhouse, now reduced to ashes. The Peterson garage with its empty space where a box of tapes once stood. The Harrington home with its mirror that still reflects more than it should. The Blackwood adobe house that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The stretch of Alaskan wilderness where a family vanished without a trace. The Montgomery Victorian with its sealed corridor. The Chen home with its lingering sense of presence. These places exist not just as physical locations, but as psychological territories, as landscapes of the human mind where the unprocessed experiences of generations accumulate like sediment. The family secret is a form of haunting, but not necessarily in the supernatural sense. It is the haunting of the present by the past, of the living by the dead, of the conscious by the unconscious. It is the weight of history made personal, the burden of ancestry made immediate. What these stories also reveal is the tension between the desire to know and the fear of knowing, the pull toward revelation and the push toward concealment. Each discovery of a family secret represents a choice to continue the containment or to risk the disruption that comes with acknowledgement. David Miller burning the recordings, Mark Peterson destroying the tapes, Jennifer Harrington disappearing into the mystery, Thomas Blackwood accepting the offering, Daniel Morales documenting the Wallace case, Emily Montgomery becoming the guardian, Maya Chen reframing her understanding. They all represent different responses to the revelation of family secrets. Some choose destruction, some transformation, some integration, some continuation of the patterns that have been established. There is no right or wrong way to respond to the discovery of what has been hidden, only the personal choice of how to carry what has been uncovered. The family secret persists because it serves a function. It protects family members from truths they might not be ready to face. It maintains a sense of continuity in the face of disruptive realities. It creates a shared narrative that binds family members together, even in silence. Yet this protection comes at a cost, as the stories we've explored tonight demonstrate. The secret becomes a burden that shapes decisions, influences relationships, and sometimes determines the course of lives. The Miller children's fear of birds, the Peterson family's emotional distance, the Harrington women's cycle of tragedy, the Blackwood family's ritual sacrifices, the Wallace family's disappearance, the Montgomery guardian's isolation, the Chen women's inherited anxiety all represent the price of containment, the cost of keeping certain truths in the shadows. The family secret is a paradoxical entity, both protective and destructive, both binding and dividing, both preserving and limiting. As we conclude tonight's exploration of family secrets, we are left with the recognition that every family has its hidden rooms, its sealed boxes, its unspoken agreements. The American landscape is not just a physical territory, but a psychological one, a vast expanse of individual and collective histories that overlap and intersect in ways we can barely comprehend. The family secret is perhaps the most American of stories, a narrative of containment and revelation, of preservation and transformation, of the tension between what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. These secrets persist not because families are inherently deceptive or malicious, but because the human psyche has a limited capacity for processing trauma, for integrating experiences that overwhelm our understanding of ourselves and our world. The family secret is a coping mechanism, a way of containing what cannot be fully contained, of managing what cannot be fully understood. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. The Snowbound Screams continues to document the verified accounts that remind us of the mysteries that exist just beyond the edge of our understanding, in the hidden corners of our homes and the unexplored territories of our minds. Each story we share contributes to a larger understanding of the human experience, of the ways we navigate the complexities of our histories and relationships. The family secret is not just a source of horror or intrigue, but a reminder of our capacity for resilience, for finding ways to carry what we cannot fully process, for creating meaning out of experiences that defy easy explanation. As we move through the landscapes of our lives, we carry with us the accumulated experiences of generations, both known and unknown, acknowledged and unacknowledged. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, not just in its physical dimensions, but in the psychological territories that families navigate behind closed doors. Thank you for watching Snowbound Screams. Until next time,